few minutes, we'll just have a bit of a discussion. So please do come up from both the earlier parts, and Louise, come up as well, please. Yeah, that'd be great. What I was trying to bring together is really fascinating overview from all sides, from the clinical side, from the four nations, and also and also from the patient and patient advocate side from UK. So try and bring together some of those themes and see what, between particularly just the focusing on the first part of the session this afternoon, in terms of between those four different nations, what those different countries have done well, and how we can bring forward that from a truly national perspective. My observation, but I'm going to perhaps come to you first, Martin, particularly with your experience in relation to getting approvals of generic drugs that are not approved through NICE, is that we are a little, in England, process seems to be the most important thing rather than anything else. And please do feel free to join us on the stage if you'd like to as well, because I think we've got different sides of the process here in the room, and I think I'd be really keen to have a wide discussion about that. And I was really interested to hear that actually a kind of a simpler, clinically led platform exists, for example, in Scotland, where we can perhaps look to utilise new treatments. And Martin showed us the MUC9 data as a sneak preview, which, I think if that was a pharma study, we wouldn't even be having a conversation about it. That would go through NICE without even a debate. It's so compelling, the data. So I'm interested, Martin, your perspective on that.
I can only agree with you. I think this is really kind of the learnings that we've had. And I have to say, if you look internationally, I think, every day I'm grateful for the options that we're getting through this process. The developments that we've seen most recently with biospecifics and fourth line, for example, it hasn't been an awfully long lag period until we were able to have access to it. Yes, it took a bit longer than other countries, but overall, we're having, I think, good options. Nevertheless, I do agree, and I think we're looking, across to Scotland a little bit in envy that there is, I think, something that has made the process more dominant than actually the discussion about what the unmet need is. And I think a lot of it, of course, has to do with concern over cost and spiraling costs, and that's the case everywhere. So I think, again, we need to be mindful that it's not everything that's wrong in this process, but somehow I think along the way, that process of who can feed into the process apart from the formalized process for the industry route has somehow been lost in England, as it seems like.
Matt, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Any thoughts as to what we can do?
Hear me? Is this working? No. Not sure what to do with it. Is that better? Right. Okay. Sorry. User malfunction. I wanted to say, first of all, that I'm very glad that we have NICE. NICE do a very difficult and absolutely essential job. I would not want to be in a healthcare system where we didn't have someone who was looking closely at clinical and cost effectiveness and holding industry to account. And they have been a key part of the collaboration through industry, through clinicians, that have delivered a completely transformed pathway. I was looking as part of the, I think it must have been looking at work on elranatamab. I was looking at the pomalidomide dexamethasone approval in 2017, when the comparators were panabinostat, bendamustine, and conventional chemo. So I think that gives you some sense of how far we've travelled. And I wouldn't want this conversation not to recognise that. But I do think that we are entering into very, very different territory, where the complexity of the pathway, the need to pursue personalisation, the kind of workload that NICE is experiencing means that we do have to look at different ways to make this work. We have to try and take more of a whole pathway approach. And we are working with Martin and very strongly support the CPAG proposal to pursue commissioning of the MUC9 combination, because to me that's personalised medicine in action. And if we really can't go some way to getting that delivered, then I think it's not particularly hopeful. So I wanted to say that we are very much of the view that more can and should be done, really for the service to take control of some of these issues, and also to look at some of these whole generic combinations where actually we could be saving money. It could be costing less or at least cost neutral.
Thank you. And Louise, you talked about some of those priorities, just picking up on one or two, particularly around having effective first and second line treatments with minimal toxicity.
Yeah, less aggressive. In an ideal world, it'd be nice to have less aggressive treatments and replace the sort of stem cell transplant. It'd also be nice to replace the bone marrow biopsies, although I do think that is in the workings, which I'm quite excited about, because being non-secretory, that sort of always fails for me anyway. But yeah.
That's actually quite a good plug for the next meeting, which is going to be really focusing on diagnostics as well, and some new techniques, diagnostics and response assessment, which hopefully we can reduce the number of bone marrow biopsies that we have to do in the fullness of time. Any questions from the audience here or from online? Or is there anything that you wanted to say? And absolutely, must echo Sheila's comments, so I didn't want to come in too negative, because absolutely, in terms of the range of treatment options we have available, have been immense over the last few years. Well, that's some really positive news, because that's very much, Martin set up this group called the Pathway Optimization Group, and essentially that's a group to parallel the sort of the pharma-led applications, which are always going to exist and always going to be really important in the newest therapies. But actually, it very much mirrors some of the things we were talking about this morning in terms of the experience that Gordon and Damien and others have had over the last 25 years in terms of developing clinical trials, and us to actually be able, from a UK perspective, to be able to implement in clinical practice those trials in terms of delivery to patients, as opposed to purely the trials that the pharma companies have developed.
Is it okay if I just very briefly, I promise very briefly, and that's just to say that obviously, and it's very much the way we approach it at Myeloma UK, that this is a collaborative effort, and industry have a huge role to play. There are a very large numbers, we did an analysis of this, of non-submissions in myeloma, disproportionately high. There's also a disproportionately high number of niche and optimised recommendations. Now, that's not all within the gift of NICE to resolve, particularly not on niche and optimised recommendations. Vast majority of that lies, I would argue, with the companies. And we have seen, I'm not going to mention specifics, but we have seen some more innovative approaches recently of companies who did try to think creatively about how they could get approvals across the whole pathway, and not just going for one line, much smaller than their licensed indication, purely because that's where they get the biggest commercial option. And I think it is for industry to look to their own responsibilities and think about how they can be part of working differently.
So, Kerry.
Yes, so thank you very much, Sheila, and everyone for their comments. Just to pick up on something that Charles mentioned, I think the biggest challenge for getting through, for example, the MUC9 treatment schedule is not the substitution of lenalidomide for thalidomide and adding in cyclo, it will be the extended consolidation. And there's an example where it might get pulled up by saying, well, that's not licensed or available in that particular group of patients. But what we're constantly faced with is that things are licensed, but at a slightly different set of circumstances. So DRD at first relapse is licensed, and so it's not approved by NICE, but we're playing this game of needing to wait for patients to progress and being restricted by licensing rules that don't necessarily mean that there's not effectiveness and it's not tolerable for patients. It's just, it's just jargon, basically.
I just want to quickly pick up on, just last couple of minutes, something that I think, Sarah, you mentioned about capacity. So we get the new drugs approved. Obviously, the cost of the drugs are funded, but actually there's a significant challenge. I think you said 28% in...
Yeah, in Belfast in last year, 28% increase in SACT activity through our own unit. Now, that's across the board, but it is something we're struggling with, particularly with a workforce that is under-resourced. So the cancer strategy for Northern Ireland recognised that. While we were keen to expand our consultant workforce, we recognise that in recent years we have been unable to do that, and therefore in order to try and shore up the SACT delivery, it was largely looking at the expansion of non-medical prescribers and pharmacy roles in that as well, just in whatever way we could to try and sustain the service and meet the growth demands. Yeah. So it'd be interested to see what other people are doing, and I'm sure those challenges are felt everywhere.
I certainly absolutely realise that the commissioning is nothing to do with NICE whatsoever, but actually obviously devolved NHS England and certainly within England, potentially ICBs and the other bodies that exist within the nations. But it's certainly a big challenge, I think, in that I don't want to get too technical about it, but actually the money doesn't follow the treatment necessarily. And I think we're all very much in a similar position in terms of it's fantastic that we've got these opportunities for new treatments, but where we are struggling, I think, is actually having the resource to deliver, be it physical space or staffing resource. And I think probably coming together with Marley UK on behalf of my UKMS and Marley UK together to really kind of highlight that, I think is something that actually I don't think is really always fully appreciated. For example, just in our own organisation, we had a process by which NICE approved drugs are automatically approved to be given, which is great, but actually there was no awareness a year or two ago about the actual impact of, and this is across all cancer, there wasn't to myeloma, the impact of the additional clinic visits, day unit visits, time to deliver scans and everything else, which I know are costed in the health economic analysis, but the funding doesn't necessarily always follow through from that health economic analysis. So that's a kind of a much trickier thing to resolve, but is actually on the ground really a significant practical issue. Great, we have overrun a little bit, but I think it's been a really good discussion, and thank you very much to all of our speakers and panellists. So just to say to rejoin when we're going to be really talking about the future in about 20 minutes' time at 10 to.